Well, good afternoon. I am Delsa Chapman, Deputy Superintendent of Educator, Student, and School Supports at the Michigan Department of Education. Welcome to the Teaching Comprehensive History webinar series designed to expand educator historical knowledge. The Teaching Comprehensive History Initiative was created from the vision of our State Superintendent of Public Instruction, Dr. Michael Rice. Teaching history through diverse viewpoints and highlighting historical movements and moments that have shaped our nation will increase enthusiasm and engagement for history and civics. We appreciate Dr. Rice's vision and leadership in this and other work connected to ensuring access, opportunities, welcoming, and belonging for all Michigan's students. Thank you for taking the time to join us today. And now I pass off the webinar to Ms. Renee Garcia, our Director of Diversity, Equity, and Inclusion here at the Michigan Department of Education. Renee?
Thank you, Dr. Chapman. I appreciate it. And I'm going to get us started. Good afternoon, and thank you everyone for joining us. We are thrilled to have all of you in attendance as we continue the Comprehensive History webinar series. Before I turn over the presentation to today's presenter, I have some housekeeping announcements. Participants' video, audio, and chat features have been turned off. Questions for our presenter may be added using the Q&A feature. Questions will be addressed toward the end of the event as time permits. If time does not permit, questions will be addressed through email. We will provide links to resources throughout today's presentation. This presentation is being recorded and will be available on the Teaching Comprehensive History website. If you would like sketchies for attending today, please be sure to sign in the sketchies link that will be provided on several occasions in the chat during this presentation. You can adjust your speaker view options anytime by selecting the view button right of the Zoom window. At the conclusion of the webinar today, a survey will be emailed to participants. Please share your feedback as it helps to inform future webinars. Closed captioning and an American Sign Language interpreter have been provided. If closed captioning isn't automatically visible, select the Show Subtitle option. Your interpreter for today is Candace B. Thank you, Candace. The Teaching Comprehensive History webinars are intended to lift the knowledge of educators so that in turn you may provide opportunities for your students to think critically and explore history from multiple perspectives that you may not have heard before. As you listen today, you're invited to explore these opportunities to take new learnings, insights, and ideas into your communities. Without further delay, please welcome Dr. Jorge Chinea. Dr. Chinea's specialization in colonial Latin American history makes him a sought-after content expert to learn from. He has researched and lectured across the globe and has been recognized by many distinguished organizations for his work. It's an honor to be working and learning from you today, Dr. Chinea.
It's a pleasure to be back to the second segment of the webinar series. I want to thank Renee and Scott and Dr. Rice and everyone else who has had a part in organizing this forum because I also believe that this is the type of initiative that will help all of us get a better grasp about what history is, particularly United States history, and how that connects with Latin American history. Because at the present moment, we have a large portion of our population, numbering about 60 million and growing, who are individuals whose heritage in part emanates from South America, Central America, and the Caribbean. And of course, many of those individuals also have a portion of them that were already in the United States at different points in its development from the 13 colonies all the way to the modern era. So you know, if you are like me, as a teacher or as an administrator, when you think about the labor rights movement, I think many of us initially think about Cesar Chavez and Dolores Huerta. Uh, and this is because they were instrumental back in the 1950s and through the 1960s in organizing migrant workers so that they could get a better deal as workers on the field, and so that they can also get better wages and better health care and better overall labor conditions so that they too um, can pick themselves off from their bootstraps, so to speak, and raise families and integrate themselves into this country. Unfortunately, back in the 1950s and 60s, that was not the case. So Cesar Chavez had to do that. I want you to think a little bit about Cesar Chavez and Dolores Huerta when you think about the labor rights movement in terms of who they were, right? I'm not saying that I want you to do a biographical research on them, but just, kind of get acquainted with them. I did that as a matter of, training myself and getting prepared to be a teacher. You always like to know a little bit about people. Cesar Chavez was actually born in Arizona. His family were native to this region for many, many generations. Their land was the part of the land that belonged to Mexico before 1848. This is before the Mexican-American War. And those lands would eventually become part of the continental mass of the United States after that year. The process by which Cesar Chavez or his ancestors became Americans are fraught with all types of tensions. When you occupy territory, whether it's here in the United States or in another part of the world, invariably that occupation involves force, right? People don't necessarily welcome outsiders to take over their territories, even if their governments agree to give up those territories. The people on the ground may not get notifications, right? Or like we say colloquially, didn't get the memo. And even if they got the memo, they may not go along with it. Simply because they have their own self-interest that may be different from the interest of the state. In this case, the Mexican government had a lot of difficulties settling and developing, or as we might call it today, exploiting the northern provinces of Mexico, which would eventually become part of the US Southwest. And the people on the ground engaged in all kinds of activities. They traded with Anglo-Americans, they traded with Native Americans. At different points, they have, relationships, commercial and otherwise, with persons from other countries like France and England, Spain, and so on. And so they were on a different rhythm. So Cesar Chavez is carrying part of that legacy on his shoulders. The reason why he left Arizona and ended up in California organizing workers is precisely because he couldn't make a living in Arizona. His family lost their properties, right? Many of the people in the US Southwest derive a living from the land, mostly through sheep herding and agricultural production. Although they also did some timbering, they did mining, they did, fishing, they did other things, but generally they were a pastoral people. And in fact, we inherited much of the cowboy culture, and we inherited many of the fruits and vegetables that are consumed daily in the United States to the early pioneers from Spain and Mexico who colonized that area, along with the Native Americans that were already living in those spaces. So when you look at the mining technology, when you look at the agricultural technology, when you look at the names of our rivers and cities and states, you see the huge imprint, right, or the footprint of those early settlers who were involved in initially settling, but at one point colonizing those very same regions. And so their whole lifestyle was changed in 1848, right? They were essentially in control of their lives, and through an act of annexation, their lives were turned upside down. They no longer had the same power and control over their lives than the people that are now in charge of that region. And that's very important to remember, because the definition of minority status in most sociological and anthropological and even historical books basically describe minority status initially as a result of changes that causes people to lose control over their lives, over their livelihoods, over their destinies, their religious beliefs, even their languages. And we begin to see many of that in 1848. And, one of the first things that happen when you occupy the territory is that you have a treaty, right? Mexico and the United States wanted to put things in writing, in part to protect each other's interests, so that there will not be any confusion later on. And for this purpose, they signed an agreement known as the Treaty of Guadalupe Hidalgo. Anyone who's listening today can go online, especially to the US National Archives and the Library of Congress, and upload a copy of that treaty. If you do, and if you track down the genesis of that treaty, you will observe something that is very, very interesting. When the treaty was drafted, the government of Mexico made sure that they include a clause that protected, that offered guarantees to the now Mexican Americans for the rights of ownership to land and other resources that they had. And that clause was included in that treaty all the way to the ratification of that treaty at the US Senate. When the US Senate ratified that treaty, it eliminated Article 10. Article 10 of the Treaty of Guadalupe Hidalgo was the article that protected, offered guarantees against the illegal, unethical occupation and essentially theft of the lands that were owned by the people in that area. Some of these land really went back to the 16th century, because the way the Spanish government worked is that they claimed the territory for the royal crown, in this case, the monarchy. And the monarchy then offered concessions, right, or land grants to people for different purposes, in essentially as a reward for participating in the settlement and colonization of the Americas. So if you were a participant at that time, you would appeal to the royal authorities for a grant, and the government, if once they review your particular petition or request, they will decide whether you deserve a specific plot of land. And so many people passed those land titles that should have been issued or were issued back in the 16th and 17th century downwards to their relatives. But by the time 1848 comes about, as you can imagine, most people didn't have those titles stashed away in some type of safe deposit box, right? There were no computers, there was no copiers, there was no, way for people to protect them. And remember what I said from the beginning, that a lot of these territories had a very weak institutional foundation, right? The Spanish government did not settle those territories as much as they should have. And when when those territories became part of Mexico, the Mexican government was too busy, right? Developing a nation building campaign and developing a process like a constitutional convention and institutions of government uh, to deal with these territorial issues. So the end result is that the people in those territories, including the family of Cesar Chavez, were at a distinct disadvantage. And so when you have colonizers come into your community, they don't always treat you with the respect that you would expect. Why? Because colonizers are interested in taking over. That's what the word colonizing means. And they use force to achieve those means, or that means, I'm sorry, that goal. So consequently, many people of Mexican descent, now Mexican Americans, will gradually lose control, not only of those lands, but everything around their lives, right? Um, you will see that initially when the educational system was set up, and this is something that you as educators we want to highlight, right, in your in your work with students. When those schools were settled, they were settled pretty much in the same manner that we settled the American Indian schools with the Bureau of Indian Affairs, which, by the way, the American Indians call it the bossing Indians around Bureau. Um, but anyway, they created what they call Mexican schools or Mexican only schools. These are, you know, substandard, underfunded, poorly constructed, and poorly staffed and poorly supplied schools where the students are not going to get a competitive education that will put them on a path for social mobility down the road. And so consequently, many Mexicans initially were miseducated, right? And this miseducation will go on into the modern era. So if you're miseducated and you don't know your history, you don't know your background, you don't know where your family comes from, you don't know why is it that you speak Spanish, or why is it that you have an indigenous background, or why is it that you have an African background or an Asian background, then you have gaps. And those gaps are usually filled with misinformation and incomplete information. And people walk around not knowing a lot about who they are. When you don't know who you are, you don't really feel good about succeeding in life, right? People who don't have a positive self-esteem will probably end up having high self-hatred and a low self-esteem. Uh, People who don't have a positive understanding of their roots are likely to feel uprooted or not rooted. And once you had these school systems in place, it would take until the 1950s and 60s for the Equal Opportunity Program, the EOP, passed into law in 1967 for many young Latinos of Mexican descent to start breaking into college and to start getting an educational opportunity. If I may digress for a minute, I know this very well because I was an EOP student. In fact, I started college in 1974 with a high school equivalency diploma. I did not finish high school. I had an accent when I came from Puerto Rico in 1967. I couldn't get rid of it. I couldn't speak English fluently. I did not know about the language in Puerto Rico, so I had to learn it in the United States. I went through the public school system with deficiencies, and it took me a while in taking English as a second language in college, about 30 credits before I can actually start taking regular classes. Classes that other students get in more, well-off communities, they get those classes as part of what they call AP, advanced placement, or even summer enrichment programs. I didn't have many of those. And so those same experiences of growing up in that timeline and feeling dispossessed, feeling marginalized, is what drove Cesar Chavez to organizing workers. Because remember that in organizing workers, you're also organizing families, right? Family is very important in Latino households. When you help people economically, educationally, you're also empowering them to do well economically getting a good job and hopefully entering, the well-off population, right? And not necessarily being stuck in a dependent mode, unable to get out of it through intergenerational poverty, which was popularized in the United States until recently, the underclass phenomenon. There are many, many Latino students and many Latino households that are stuck in that underclass status. But anyway, so Cesar Chavez was part of 4 people, right, who emerged during the early to late 1960s to challenge the condition under which many Latino people were living in the United States. And the other one was Rodolfo Corky Gonzalez. He developed something called the Crusade for Justice. There was Rios Lopez Tijerina in New Mexico. Corky was in Colorado. Rios Lopez Tijerina felt that the land grants that his ancestors and his modern day peers in New Mexico have been illegally seized by the U.S. government. They developed, national preserves and public parks, and some of the other land was used to develop railroads or to develop commercial agriculture, what we call agribusiness. He felt that there was a need to rethink that and go back to the records and restore people's land. So that was his take. Rodolfo Coqui Gonzalez was looking at civil rights. Why is it that we are not allowed to go to good school? Why is it that, that we are in a subordinate, marginalized status? And then there was Jose Angel Gutierrez in Texas. He was so fed up with the mistreatment and the essentially their discrimination to which many Tejanos were being subjected to, that he decided that neither the Democratic Party nor the Republican Party could help him. So he decided to create an alternative political party called La Raza Unida Party, the Raza United Party, or the People's United Party. And then there were the Young Lords in New York City and in Chicago. They were protesting against police brutality, about the lack of sanitation in communities, the spread of diseases that were preventable, to which people were not, provided medications or treatment in many of the medical facilities in New York and Chicago. So you have all these different people. I guess my point is this: it's difficult to study the labor rights movement without understanding that there were many challenges in the 60s, with labor rights being one of the more important ones, but certainly not the only one. And that even the people who were promoting labor rights were also simultaneously promoting, improve health care. They were, talking about bilingual education. Some of them were talking about better housing. Uh, Other people were talking about, job training. Um, so there were multiple needs, all caused by the loss of power and control of the Mexican American population as a result of the annexation of the territories that once belonged to Mexico. They were rendered minorities as a result of that. So I put this up here so that you can get a feel of the mindset that essentially fueled that process that up all the way leading to 1846. This is, John O'Sullivan, a journalist, an attorney, who was also an expansionist. They had people like that at that time. They had them everywhere, ironically enough. John O'Sullivan did not say anything that the Europeans in different countries in the old continent would not have been saying at that time. And when you read the piece where this particular excerpt comes from, you begin to see that he is concerned about the potential, for France or England, or perhaps even Spain, to recontrol those spaces west of the Mississippi and south of the 13 colonies that belong to Mexico. And so it was not just an expansionism for expansionist, a motive, right? It was also, a concern that perhaps those territories were weak or unstable, and that we, the United States, would be better suited or able to control them and to get the most out of them economically, socially, and so on and so forth. So what was behind Manifest Destiny? If you look what's behind Manifest Destiny, that would eventually lead to what we call the annexation of the territories, is this notion that the people, first of all, that the land is empty. Modern day, scholars have pointed this out over and over again. In the 18th and 19th century, European nations and also countries here in the Americas view the frontier areas as areas to be controlled and then tamed. They believe that the cities that the Europeans had created were the sites of economic development and civilization, and that the areas surrounding those cities was a wilderness, a hinterland. And by extension, the people living in those areas were equally uncivilized, equally, undomesticated, equally wild. And those tendencies spread not only amongst European nations with pretension to expand their territorial areas in Africa and in Asia, but also in the Americas. And they carry that belief over. So I guess what I'm saying is, if you only look at O'Sullivan, and if you only look at the consequences of what Manifest Destiny did in the acquisition of the Mexican territories, you are limiting your understanding to just the mainland, in the United States, and we forget to see these global consequences and the global outreach that some of these ideas were reaching in the 18th and 19th century. And so, how did the people feel about the land? Well, the land is empty, right? The land is unexploited. The land is inhabited by people who are not making the best use off of it. They're not developing the resources. They are living essentially subsistence on the subsistence conditions. They're only growing what they need to eat, using what they need to use, and they're not deriving a profit, right, out of it. And this mentality of mercantilism, capitalism, dictated at that particular time that those resources be exploited. So you have a lot of these other elements intertwined together, working in tandem, um, and pushing more and more people like O'Sullivan uh, towards the goal of expanding the frontier, taming it, uh, exploiting it, developing it, and deriving income out of it. And in so doing, they disregarded one, that the territories were not empty, right? There were people living in those territories. And two, that the people there were in fact deriving income. Otherwise, how could you explain what I said at the beginning, right? All of the fruits and vegetables that would eventually be grown in those territories were already imported in decades and centuries before by the Spaniards, including the mule, the horses, the sheep. All of those came from Europe. And so the technology that was already used by the Spanish government, in combination with what the Indians knew and what was contributed by the local population, is what made mining a successful enterprise. And that was already being done not only in the territories in what we now call the Mexican section of the Mexican or the US Southwest, but it was being done in Mexico, in the southern sections of it. It was being done in Peru. It was being done in the Caribbean. At one point, Puerto Rico was one of the leading exporters of gold at one point. And there were other territories like the Dominican Republic that eventually became another major exporter of gold. So mining was taking place all over the place. The natives were not just sitting back with a guitar on their hand, smoking a cigar and laying flat on a hammock, wasting the hours away. This stereotype is something that was created in the 18th and 19th century as a way to justify taking over those territories and forcing those people to work. But not to work, but to work for the new companies that will take over those territories. So the idea was to depict them as lazy, idle, as people that were loafing around, people that were wandering about without any fixed domicile, as people who essentially were motivated by maybe illegal games and other activities, and not necessarily working hard to derive income. But that's what's driving these forces. And you begin to see this in O'Sullivan here, when he said that it is the manifest destiny of the United States to overspread and to possess the whole of the continent. This is what's driving it. And there is, essentially, when you read this, if you read it in isolation, it is what it is. If you read it in comparison to other global events similar to this, then you begin to see this, that this was already taking place even before, in the 14th and 15th century. This is what explains why Marco Polo will pave a Silk Road to Asia, right? According to the mentality of the time, the Asians, they know what to do with this silk. We know. So we're going to go there and grab it and then sell it and make textiles, develop factories. Eventually, we will develop the industrial economy. And then we will sell the Asians the same material, the garments that we produce, to them at a significant, price. Therefore, we will make money So the extraction of raw materials from other parts of the world for, transportation to Europe is what began the Industrial Revolution in Europe. The exportation of gold from the Americas and later fruits and vegetables is what will fuel the Industrial Revolution. The tobacco, the sugar, the cotton, all of those things will be made into raw materials that will be sold later on to other parts of the world. It would also explain why the Portuguese rationalized their expansion in Africa as a very sanitized version of Lusotropicalism. In other words, we're not colonizing them, we're just spreading our culture towards them so that they can take advantage of what we know, and together we can make something different. Of course, the Africans did not just make something different, they were at a distinct disadvantage because their land would eventually be taken. And out of those lands, the Portuguese will create the countries of Angola and Mozambique, which will become free, by the way, in the 1970s. It took 200-300 years after the, if not more, after the Portuguese went in those territories for those people to gain their self-determination. The Spanish did the same thing in the La Reconquista, which is a prelude to the conquest of the Americas, right? You push the Muslim population and then later the Jewish population out of the Iberian Peninsula. You consolidate a Catholic culture, and then you begin to expand the religious frontiers outside of the peninsula out into the overseas territory. So the Spanish extended the so-called religious frontier onto the Canary Islands, which is where my ancestors come from, by the way. And then when they perfected that technique, then they went into the Caribbean and implemented it there. And then from the Caribbean, which became a sort of experimental ground for European colonization, they essentially use it as a stepping stone for bringing the same sort of approach into the mainland territories, beginning in South America and eventually Central America and ultimately North America. So this is not different what happened with Manifest Destiny than what happened in other parts of the world. And you begin to see this, in the 15th century, and the Spaniards would actually try to divide the world between themselves and the Portuguese. Many people probably were not even aware of that. They created a fictitious, demarcation line on the Atlantic, sort of like straight in the middle. And then they decided among them two that one part of the land to the west of that line would belong to Spain, and the part of the land to the east of that territory, or that line, excuse me, would belong to the Portuguese. And this is the line that I was referring to here. You'll notice that the first line, it says 1493. This is the line that the Spanish made, right? It's self-interest dictates this particular line. So the Spanish say, okay, we'll put that line there, and the territory to the east will be the Portuguese. Then the Portuguese said, wait a minute. We had an explorer from our country that went into Brazil in 1501 or 1502. Therefore, we deserve to move the line a little to the west. And that's how the line was redrawn. You don't see the French there. You don't see this English. You don't see the Danish. And you don't see the Dutch. They were considered undocumented. They were considered aliens. They were considered outsiders, interlopers, intruders. They shouldn't be coming to the Americas. So these attitudes are old. They're not necessarily created in the United States. They were already on the air. And so We begin to see even in Brazil, the Brazilian government and also the Argentinian government also expanded the frontier in a way that's similar to the way the frontier was expanded in the United States. President Faustino Sarmiento believed that Buenos Aires is the heart of civilization, and that all of the, the provinces surrounding Buenos Aires, which would eventually become Argentina, is a barbaric hinterland. And then it needs to be tamed, it needs to be conquered, and then it needs to be exploited. Freddie Jackson Turner in the United States said the same thing 50 years later. The frontier is what distinguishes the United States from any other country. We continually expand the frontier. And what he meant by that was, in his mind, that we continue to expand civilization, that we continue to expand democracy. What he didn't get at that particular time, and other people have brought out since then, is that when you expand the frontier, you're also impacting the people on the other side. In this case, Native Americans and Mexicans. And you are rendering them powerless. You're disempowering them. Because when you take over that frontier, usually the institutions of the new colonizing power will be instituted, and the people that were once there in control are no longer in control. And so how do you achieve that, by the way? Well, the first thing is you create institutions of government that will be new to the new subject people, such as English as your official language. You can also institute a new religion for the state, right? You can put into places, different systems of oppression that would ensure that the subject population will not step out of line. In this particular case, the government in Texas created Texas Rangers. The Texas Rangers was an agency of the state that essentially kept Mexicans in their place. It forced them to not to take action, concerted action, that would result in the new Anglo-American population being somehow displaced or inconvenienced in some way from their original plans of taming and exploiting the new frontier. We see this in, this is a picture of the bandeirantes, which are the representatives of civilization, so to speak, right? The people who go from east to west, conquering the interior of Brazil. And in order to do that, they had to subdue the Indian population, but also some of the enslaved African population that had ran away into the woods, into the deep interior, looking for freedom, and where they created alternative societies. We see this in South America. This is I put this image in here because many people are talking about Robert De Niro lately with his new baby. And then I kind of remember that he was also a major star in this movie called The Mission, where he played the role of a slave trader and mercenary that went into the area that is sandwiched between Brazil and Argentina, which are the two countries of Uruguay and Paraguay. And his purpose in going to that region in the 18th century was to capture native peoples and then bring them over to the plantations and sell them so they can produce goods and services that the Brazilian government or the Argentinian government, which were both under Portuguese and Spanish control, will then use in the international marketplace. Eventually, he had a change of mind and he decided that he's not going to continue enslaving Indians and killing them, and he decided that he's going to fight for their civil rights. So this is an interesting movie. But here's what happened in 1848 that I just mentioned. Notice that Arizona is included there, the birthplace of Cesar Chavez, but also the place of birth of many other Latino leaders that were participating, or the ancestors who were participating in the 1950s and 60s. To some of them, the border really, they never crossed the border to the US. The border crossed them. They were already there. It's just that we redrew the borderline. And now they ended up in the US side of the border, but they were already there. The ancestors were born there, um, which also explains why there's continual migration to the US, because there were still many people on the Mexican side of the border whose ancestors lived just across the border. And so that migration had been ongoing even before they started the Border Patrol back in I think it was like in the 1920s. We developed the Border Patrol. There was no Border Patrol before the 1920s. And so this land, people moved from Mexico and from the United States back to Mexico, back and forth without anyone ever paying attention. But anyway, U.S. mining, railroad, agricultural developers would eventually move there. They need labor in order to achieve this goal of exploiting the land. So consequently, the displaced Mexicans who no longer own land and properties will become the servile, more or less servile labor force. They will be getting low pay to do backbreaking work as miners, as railroad workers. In fact, there's a term in Spanish used for railroad uh, trackers, or the people who install the tracks, is traquero. Traquero was a 19th century term used extensively in the Southwest to designate Mexican railroad track workers, or they call them also section hands. And then in the agriculture area, many of the people who work in Colorado, California, in the sugar beet area, were known as beta veleros. And that's a term that was used here in Michigan, in Saginaw particularly, and throughout other areas where the sugar beet economy emerged from about the 1880s to about the 1930s. Although it probably started before that time and it continued after that, but it seemed to have been the dominant economic motor uh, in Michigan during that time. So the beta veleros came here not because they wanted to displace local Michiganders in the workforce, but because it so happened that European migration ceased after World War I, and we couldn't get Eastern European workers to come to Michigan in order to maintain the sugar beet industry, which is necessary for the production of sugar. We needed workers to come from abroad. So the Mexicans were invited to Michigan as betaveleros, or betabel is the Spanish word for sugar beet. They were invited here and they stayed here once the job was completed. Puerto Ricans also came here. We had a movement called Operation Farm Lift in 1950. It actually started just before 1950, like 1946, 47, 48. And in that deal, sugar beet companies recruited workers in Puerto Rico. They placed them on planes and they flew them all the way to Michigan to work in Saginaw. When the Puerto Ricans got there to work in the sugar beet fields, they reported back to the government of Puerto Rico that they were being treated as slaves. They were not getting paid regularly, and they were expected to work for longer than normal hours. Many of them rebelled and they walked out of those fields, and eventually they walked all the way to Detroit. In the 1950s, they blended in with the Mexican population. And if you're familiar with the Detroit landscape, you know where 4th Street is, right? The U.S. Postal Service, the main post office in 4th Street. Near there, by 75, is the Puerto Rican Club. It's no longer, it doesn't exist anymore. When it existed, I went there and they had a little plaque in honoring the first Puerto Ricans who came there in the 1950s, who refused to stay in Saginaw and came down to Detroit. So in those territories, as I mentioned before, English will be imposed. education institutions for Mexicans only were created, and gradually this essentially minoritized the population. It rendered them powerless because they couldn't move up socially and economically. And they became a migrant population. This is what happened to Cesar Chavez. And it also happened to many other people. When I was teaching in Minnesota in a rural community, I met a young Mexican male. He had his wife and children. I asked him, where you come from? I was very naive at that time. I'll be honest with you. I didn't know why Mexicans were coming from Texas to Minnesota. Naively, I asked them, why are you leaving your homeland? Don't you have a state where you can speak Spanish, surrounded by people who look like you, eat wonderful food? I mean, come on. You have festivals, don't you? He said, no, Dr. Chinea, we're being mistreated. We we're not in a good shape. This is why we left. This is why we're here. And I said, and where you work, do they treat you okay? Well, they do fly those planes with insecticide when we're on the field, and sometimes it rains on us, and that causes all kinds of skin disorders. It's tough, Dr. Chinea. It's tough. It's not what you think it is. I said, wow, I didn't know that. And so I started visiting labor camps. I started going into the Latino communities to educate myself on what was going. And there are labor communities here in Michigan. You can go in many communities here in Michigan and still find Mexican workers living on all school buses that are converted into living quarters. Those are the lucky ones, because what I heard in Minnesota was that people were using chicken coops that were being pulled by trailers out of the barns to house the Mexican workers. In a way, the school bus with sealed windows and a sealed door sounded a little better. Obviously, it's not where you want to be, right? But those are the labor conditions that many people face. That's a reality. So if you want to see a little bit more for those teachers who are listening about, how land dispossession took place in the U.S. Southwest, I recommend that you take a look at this book by Rodolfo Acuña. It was first published in 1972, and it has had 8 editions since then. I think you would get something out of it. He meticulously documents how this land was taken and how Mexicans essentially were created into a landless, mobile population. In Mesoamerica, the same process occurred because as the United States is consolidated itself into a continental power, right? After the Civil War, the United States is now from the Atlantic, it goes all the way from the Atlantic to the Pacific. After that time, there was a need, at least from the point of view of the government, of making sure that Central America did not get as weak as supposedly Mexico was. And the same thing on the islands in the Caribbean. Puerto Rico and Cuba were engaged in a fierce struggle for independence. The United States felt that perhaps England, France, the Spaniards will eventually control the islands, and that will leave the United States out of the game. The US was predicting and projecting for the creation of naval bases that needed coal stations, points where they can stop off and reload and restock. And in order to achieve those goals, they needed to control the Caribbean, and they also needed a canal that will enable the gold from California, the gold rush. You might recall this. The gold rush, you got the gold. If you take that gold internally across the United States, you're going to encounter a lot of different problems, right? The railroad system is not fully developed. You got to have to go on horse-driven coaches. That will take a lot of time, and you may never get all the gold, right? And so one way to simplify that was to create a canal in Central America that would enable the gold from California to be shipped through that canal onto New York, and then it will complete. So in order to do that, multinational corporations eventually create a condition that nurture what we now call the backyard of the United States. The U.S. foreign policy began to be molded by the interest multinational corporations that continued to insist that they needed the protection of the U.S. government in order to maximize profits in the production of tobacco, pineapples, sugar, coffee, and so on. Next time you eat a banana, it says Chiquita Banana. Remember that Chiquita Banana is one of the earliest banana corporations that were created at a time when people thought that we had developed what they call a green empire. And what the green empire was, the empire of the fruit industry. And it was controlled by the United Fruit Company. The United Fruit Company essentially had a monopoly on the production of bananas in Central America, and they extended that monopoly to Cuba, the Dominican Republic, and later Puerto Rico. And that's just one industry. Earlier in my presentation, for those of you who came before, you might have heard when I mentioned Arturo Alfonso Schomburg, right? I mentioned that he was from Puerto Rico, born in 1874. Schomburg was educated in a tobacco shop. And the tobacco industry in Puerto Rico and Cuba was organized in such a way that they would hire a reader that would sit atop a big platform and educate the workers on historical events and political events and so on. So if you were a tobacco worker, you were sure to be educated. By the time Schomburg came to the United States in 1874, he knew what was going on in France, Russia, China, and Europe, of course, and the United States. As the tobacco people were the elite of the working class at that particular time, but the other groups were not. And so let me just kind of go down here real quick as I see Renee, we want to wrap it up. But this is a pictorial representation of how the manifest destiny really was seen by the Europeans who wanted to come this way, but they couldn't because Uncle Sam controlled the territory. And we see that even the president of Mexico adopted a form of manifest destiny. They called it positivism, and they blended in with social Darwinism. And what that meant for the government of Mexico in 1876 was that they also believed that peasants had no place in the future development of the republic. And that republic need to have Europeanized elites to make it successful, to make it look respectable in the eyes of Europe and in the eyes of the United States. So President Porfirio Diaz did not wait for the multinational corporation to come. He invited them. By the time he was out of office in 1910, the peasant population in Mexico was 95% landless. And that same population would migrate to the United States. So you see the labor process is conditioned by political processes that are outside their control. And the same thing happened in Central America with William Walker. He went in there, took over Nicaragua, reinstituted slavery, became president. Essentially, he gave himself the title of president. And then he had to be forced out of the country by other Central American countries that gang up against him and pushed them out. But in Central America, the result of this was a huge increase in labor migration to the United States as people who were displaced from the land ended up having to come to the United States looking for better opportunities. And here's a movie about that. I encourage you to use it in one of your classes. It's called El Norte, or the North. This is a book by the president of Guatemala, from where that couple came from. He was outed from the government by a CIA plot because when he began creating reforms, meaning distributing the land among the peasants so they won't have to leave Guatemala, the multinational corporations opposed him and finally got the government of the US to remove him from office. And he wrote this book, The Shark and the Sardines, as a result of that. Same thing happened in Puerto Rico. I think many of you know about this. And I end up right there.
Yeah, and you've got another week, so I don't want you to have to rush either. You've got some great content, and we're getting some questions about requests for titles of the book and authors of books. So we'll follow up to make sure that
By all means, these are
Yeah.
the resources that are available. Latino Americans is a 6-part series. You can get it on the library, and Harvest of Empire is also a video that people can get access to and use it in the classroom. A little bit too dramatic in there, so you gotta judge for your own whether this can be shown to certain age groups.
Yeah.
Certainly, you have to be very careful with some of this stuff.
Yeah, critically important for the educators to work in their communities to make those decisions. You're absolutely right. Thank you for sharing today. Again,
My pleasure.
yeah, you're
I'm
not
glad that
only
everybody was able
researchers-
to attend. I see that there was a large number of people. Congratulations for coming. Happy to answer any questions if you need to contact me. I think I have my email address here at the beginning in case you missed it. jchinea@winnie.edu. Thank you so much.
very much. Yes, I just want to remind our participants that this is, we have one more webinar. It's next week, May 24th from 4 to 5 p.m. And that's the third and final in the series with Dr. Chinea and the labor rights movement. We encourage educators to visit the Teaching Comprehensive History website and to register for each date to participate in the future webinars. They all do have new content, as you can see. Thank you for joining us today and the work that you do for Michigan students. Please make sure that you complete this survey that will be emailed to you as soon as the event is closed tonight. We really appreciate your time and your energy and your courage. Thanks and have a great day.